Jimmy Keene narrates in the opening scenes, introducing viewers to 90s America and his rock and roll lifestyle. The former star athlete is now a wealthy drug dealer, living in a fancy mansion, driving a sports car, and sleeping with whoever he likes. Jimmy's riding high until one of his own employees tries to steal his goods, and then the FBI come knocking. They raid his house, seizing drugs, cash, and a battalion's worth of weaponry. The charming drug dealer finds himself in prison, looking at a lengthy sentencing. Jimmy's father comes to give him the lowdown. He'll likely go down for 5 years, but would be out in 4 on good behavior. His dad tells him to take the deal, so Jimmy pleads guilty. The judge states that if this went to trial, he'd be looking at 25 years away, but they'll give him 10 instead. It would seem Jimmy has been tricked, losing a decade of his life in the process. We catch up with Jimmy 7 months later. He's adapting well to prison life, making a small profit as a porn dealer. It's clearly not the most ideal situation though, and his only glimmer of hope comes in the form of a deal which could see Jimmy out of jail in record timing. FBI agent Lauren McCauley offers him an early release if he is willing to transfer to a maximum security prison for the criminally insane, befriend a murderer, and get the guy to confess. They need the location of at least one dead girl, maybe up to 13. It's a superb premise that is brimming with potential. Jimmy turns down the offer and goes back to his dreary existence, handing out porn magazines to eerie inmates and working out whenever he can. His father tells him to reject the deal, warning Jimmy about the hell that awaits him at Springfield, Missouri. Jimmy contemplates the offer some more and starts to read up on the file of the criminal he'd be coercing. This nicely leads us into the investigation. The series rewinds to 4 years earlier, and Detective Brian Miller is hot on the case, back in 1993. This family man is investigating the murder of a young girl called Jessica Roach, who was found dead in a farmer's field in Indiana. Following up on a promising lead, Brian believes a man called Larry Hall may be their prime suspect. Described as a harmless weirdo, this creep is known by the local enforcement for harassing young girls whilst driving around the neighborhood in his gray van. Brian manages to arrange an interview with the suspect and brashly interrogates the man. All the police officers keep telling Brian that Larry is a serial confessor who just loves to talk, but the detective thinks otherwise. The van matches a witness's statement. Larry has admitted to being in the area the day before the girl went missing, and the creep has a history of criminal activity. Larry concedes to as much, and then explains how he has vivid dreams of murdering women. Nothing incriminating there then. He does, however, finally accept the deal, yet Lauren informs him that they have other candidates in the pipeline. In the second installment, he follows the interview process and starts to train for his future role as Larry's confidant. Jimmy must befriend a murderer and elicit a confession from the psychopath. Lauren plays mind games with Jimmy, trying to get him to see things from Larry's point of view. They discuss what Jimmy loves and hates about women, attempting to find some common ground between the two criminals. Lauren then pushes Jimmy into a more personal conversation, talking about his awful upbringing, again trying to find links between the two inmates, whilst addressing Larry's warped worldview at the same time. The writers do a stellar job of upping the ante with Jimmy's storyline, giving him another reason to accept the deal. His father is seriously ill, having suffered from a stroke, which has left him weak and forgetful. Jimmy is warned that if he doesn't get out soon, he may never see his dad again. The stakes are building and Jimmy has no other options. Meanwhile, Brian's aggressive approach to the interrogation has upset Larry, who asks to go home. Brian plans one final assault and brings in the FBI to help land this serial killer. Larry's confession is a slow burner, but one that feels authentic in its delivery. Larry hints early on that he's ready to disclose some incriminating information, starting by saying that he would fail a polygraph test and that he isn't sleeping well. He has nightmares. He's depressed and lonely. This all effortlessly leads to the discussion of women, and then Larry is shown the photograph of Jessica Roach. He talks about burying bodies and folding up the victim's clothes. The police are perilously close to an unabashed confession. Larry signs the confession paperwork, although after speaking with a lawyer, he claims it to be forced and fake. He barks that they twisted his words and coerced the simpleton into these lies. In court, the lawyers plead a similar case, leaving Lauren and the gang not very long to prove his guilt before Larry is inevitably released. Another time pressure for Lauren and Jimmy, further fueling the tensions. Jimmy continues to train for his transfer, learning that he must become a brother to Larry, always looking out for the killer and passing no judgment. Having aced the tests, Jimmy successfully passes the audition and makes the daunting trip to his new home, a maximum security prison for the criminally insane. He'll be entering as an arms dealer in civilian clothing. Jimmy is cautioned not to add any more time to his sentence, avoiding maiming others or been caught in any criminal acts. Again, the writers keep piling on the pressure with this additional dilemma: how will he survive if he cannot defend himself? It's an enticing concept. The two inmates only mere cells apart. It is unclearly whether Larry did the crimes or not, and Jimmy's chances of success seem minimal. Jimmy meets with his shrink and recounts his first week in the new maximum security prison. They both agree that this prison is unpredictable and brutal, with flashes of stabbings and violent fights to back up this notion. He has subscribed antidepressants to fit in with the other inmates and has to memorize the shrink's phone number in case of an emergency. I'm guessing that number is going to come in handy in the not-too-distant future. The detectives rework the case on the outside, with Lauren and Brian looking over old material and delving further into each separate murder. In this chapter, Lauren starts to second-guess Larry's infamy, and one particular killing confirms her suspicions. Larry actually planted evidence in one case just to become a suspect and was only saved due to an ironclad alibi. This serial confessor is desperate for any and all of the attention, which doesn't bode well for Lauren and her team. Back on the inside, Jimmy struggles to even strike up a conversation with Larry, failing on 3 separate occasions to garner a verbal response from the killer. Larry likes to keep to himself, and Jimmy finds it tough to appear natural or approachable with the murderer. Jimmy's day is about to go from bad to worse when his father pays him an unplanned visit. Jimmy Sr. told the guards that he was a police officer and showed them his badge. This completely destroys Jimmy Jr.'s new identity, placing him in a dangerous predicament. The father apologizes and explains that he'll be renting a hotel nearby in support of his son, ready to visit at a moment's notice. Jimmy tells the guard to keep his dad's career a secret, but Carter evidently plans to use this knowledge to his own advantage. You can't trust anyone on the inside, and Jimmy learns this the hard way. Carter wants 10 grand to keep Stum. He knows Jimmy is a snitch and even researched the former drug dealer. Snitches get more than stitches in prison, and Jimmy is furious. He manages to make friends with a powerful mob boss, though, and then seizes an opportunity to befriend Larry. Larry was watching television when an inmate changed the channel. Jimmy assaults this criminal, winning the serial killer's attention. The two criminals spark up a friendship from this moment forwards, and Larry lets loose, talking endlessly about his war reenactments, his brother, and work. With a whispery, creepy voice, Larry moves on to the subject of females and delivers a spine-chilling performance. Larry's experience with women hints at his psychotic tendencies, which Jimmy sees as irrefutable evidence of the killings. Lauren visits Jimmy for an update. She's now in the murky waters of self-doubt and asks Jimmy if he thinks Larry is actually the killer. Jimmy is adamant the man did it and more determined than ever to gain his confession. He mentions the 10 grand threat from a prison guard, and Lauren states that they can't pay him off, but they can get Jimmy transferred again. The FBI agent tells Jimmy that Larry confessed to at least one crime he didn't commit, but Jimmy isn't deterred. Therefore, Lauren demands Jimmy accelerates his operation. He tells her to be ready for a call, and his mission seems more impossible with each new dilemma. In the early 70s, Larry and Jimmy were living completely different lives. Larry was thrust into the family business of grave digging, with a horrid father forcing him to dig up dead bodies to feast on their belongings. Whilst Jimmy was enjoying football practice with his inspirational father, they couldn't have been further apart. Back in the present, Jimmy starts to hunt around in Larry's unattended cell. He believes without a shadow of a doubt that Larry is the murderer they suspect he is, but still needs some proof. Any evidence Jimmy uncovers will help, but Larry's cell appears harmless on first glances. There are photographs on the wall of reenactments and sports cars. He has ordinary books and figurines on his shelves. It's only when Jimmy delicately flicks through a stack of magazines that he unearths the jackpot in debauchery. Larry has doodled over the adult mags, defacing the women. Then Jimmy finds haunting drawings of murder and torture hidden inside. Jimmy places the magazines back in place and returns to his own room, where Mr. Carter is waiting for him. This crooked guard has dirt on Jimmy and wants a large payout in return for keeping his secret silent. Jimmy tried to get cash and then drugs from his father, but no such luck. Carter is starting to lose his patience, hinting at possibly telling the other felons Jimmy's dark secret. Once the guard has left, Larry and Jimmy are reunited. Larry has become highly suspicious of Jimmy, though, spotting that he asks a lot of questions. Jimmy's emotions are getting the better of him, and he struggles to contain his anger towards the killer. Larry talks of a quiet before the storm, fearing that something awful is about to go down in the jail. And the murderer is not wrong. A riot breaks out, with many criminals and guards being attacked and stabbed in horrifying detail. The prison goes into full lockdown, and they hide in their cells. Larry is in charge of cleanup, and along with Jimmy, a handful of criminals are tasked with clearing away the chaotic remains from the riot. This works as a nice chance for Jimmy and Larry to strengthen their bond and chat in more depth. They talk childhoods and their first jobs. Larry's voice starts to irritate in these long bouts of dialogue, but this only adds to the creepy atmosphere, centering on an unknown girl. In these flashbacks, the girl goes to the beach for the first time, talks to boys, and spends time bonding with her sister. We know there's a sinister aspect coming to these rose-tinted memories, but the twist isn't revealed until the end. Back in prison, Jimmy is receiving funny looks from every single prisoner he passes. It is unclear whether the guard has already divulged Jimmy's dark secret, or if this is all a figment of Jimmy's own vivid imagination. Either way, it makes for an unsettling introduction as Jimmy walks the winding corridors to his shrink's office. His usual doctor is on vacation, and the replacement is unaware of their arrangement. She asks Jimmy why he believes he's here and warns him not to provoke other inmates, insinuating that Larry is becoming irreversibly influenced by his new friend. Meanwhile, Brian and Lauren are still working the case. They need some solid evidence to keep Larry behind bars in the event Jimmy's meddling is unsuccessful. The dynamic duo decide to reassess the locations Larry had mentioned before to the local police, hoping to find the buried bodies of his victims. Driving these empty roads, they notice a peculiarly placed gas station in the middle of nowhere. Further digging reveals that this building was just a construction site around the time of Larry's murders. Could the bodies be buried underneath all that concrete? Larry and Jimmy catch up after days apart. The killer talks about a visit from Gary and how he hates his brother's wife. The subject turns, as always, to the topic of girls, and Larry explains how girls married young in the olden days. Jimmy asks Larry what's the youngest he's ever had. Larry starts to get excited, flipping the question on Jimmy, but he's disappointed with the answer. Later, Larry talks with his own shrink in an unnerving exchange. He asks about her children and sexualizes very innocent observations. The shrink continually tries to change the subject away from her children and points out that Larry appears cocky and confident for the first time ever. He admits that his appeal is going well and he's never felt better in his whole life. The conversation steers towards Jimmy, and Larry concludes that because of this new friendship, he doesn't feel alone anymore. Jimmy tries contacting someone, possibly his old shrink, but finds he's out of credit. In the yard, Jimmy watches Carter spreading his dangerous secret to each separate gang, one at a time. When he tells the mafia boss the bad news, Jimmy panics and rushes after Larry. His window of opportunity is quickly evaporating. Jimmy finds Larry in the wood shop and makes his final play. It's an intense and creepy scene. The new friends talk about women they have slept with. Jimmy confesses to having had around 80 lovers, and Larry begs to know Jimmy's secret with the ladies. Jimmy says they just chat, but Larry says no woman ever just wants to talk to him. They move on to the subject of Jessica Roach. It is revealed that she spoke pleasantly with Larry at first, but fought back when he tried to kiss her. Larry knocked her out with a rag soaked in starter fluid and then raped her. His description is vague and scattershot, but this is an undeniable confession. You'd think Jimmy would push for the location, but he holds back. I think that might have been his last chance. Jimmy wakes from a horrific nightmare in his cell, with Larry asking if his stories are to blame. Larry confessed in grim detail to the murder of Jessica Roach, but now he's changed tactic, stating that it was all just a story. Jimmy is furious and plays Larry, calling him a liar and a fraud. This works wonders, winding him up no end. Jimmy says Larry's details are vague, and the fact he never dug a grave for Jessica Roach proves his innocence. The would-be killer falls for this ploy and swears to Jimmy that he is telling the truth, now pleading that he did commit those terrible acts. Larry ends their conversation by asking Jimmy to meet with him at the woodshop later that day, so he can fully prove his guilt. The drug dealer has worked his magic on Larry, reeling him in, hook, line, and sinker. But Jimmy eats alone at lunchtime. The other felons natter about the snitch, giving him evils from across the canteen. Jimmy wastes no time in preparing for battle, exercising in his cell. He's fast running out of time and has no way at all of contacting the outside world with his phone credit being frozen. Crooked Guard Carter asks to assist Jimmy with his many dilemmas, but wants to know who he's working for first. Jimmy even receives death threats from the mob boss to add to his woes. He needs to act now. What follows is an ingenious, if highly frustrating sequence of events Jimmy meets with Larry and instantly spies a map on the woodshop table. This map simply has to contain the whereabouts of Larry's victims, with a border of carved birds around the edge. Larry explains how he's made 21 birds, one for each of his victims. The birds are sent home for Gary to paint black, and these mementos work as guards watching over the dead. Larry says he was sick to his stomach when Jimmy called him a liar because he cares about the dead. He remembers each victim and takes his hobby very seriously, unlike Jimmy with his 80 flings. The confession is there right in front of Jimmy's eyes, but you just know he won't be swiping that map and marching to his shrink's office with that proof anytime soon. The series loves to tease and torture its audience first. Larry talks about Trisha Reitler and elaborates on the circumstances around her death too. He reflects on his actions, saying everyone wants to be seen, a celebrity. Jimmy can't fight it any longer. He lets his emotions rise to the surface and pleads with Larry to reveal the locations so the parents can finally grieve their children and stop hurting. Larry just laughs it off. Jimmy screams at Larry, calling him a monster, and the killer attacks. The guards are on hand to stop the fight, but that incriminating map remains unaccounted for. Jimmy is dragged off to confinement, where his hell is only just beginning. In the most frustrating of moments, none of the prison guards will believe Jimmy's story, and as he begs for a pencil, the map slowly slips from his memory. Jimmy is left with no other option but to draw the map on his prison wall in his own blood and spends what feels like an eternity awaiting freedom. Larry's map is posted to Gary, and the evidence is obviously burned. Lauren and Brian pay the brother a visit, and he admits that the brothers once raped a hitchhiker, but he won't accept Larry's killer disposition. Jimmy is released from confinement and draws the map on a table for Lauren to see. He recounts some of Larry's confessions as well, providing details about the 2 belts used to strangle Jessica Roach and how he folded Trisha's clothes up. Lauren says that this evidence will be enough. They've got him now. Jimmy is subsequently released, free from his entire sentencing. Jimmy breaks down as the judge delivers this verdict, and Taron Egerton shines as the broken drug dealer. Jimmy is then reunited with his father, and Ray Liotta provides a career highlight, crying at his son's return. Give this man all the awards. We're informed that Jimmy's dad died 5 years after his release, and that Larry tried to commit suicide after his appeal was denied. Gary meets his brother in jail and finally accepts the reality that Larry is a murderer, which upsets Larry more than anything. Jimmy started a successful business after the debacle, and Larry remained in prison for life.